Good afternoon and welcome to this installment of the CORBEL webinar series. Today we are very pleased to have with us Christian Oman and Steve Canham from ECRIN Eric and Rita Banzi from Mario Negri to present data sharing and reuse from clinical trials, and we're looking at principles and recommendations. My name is Vera Matzer and I'm involved in the CORBEL project on behalf of EMBL EBI, and I'll be the host of the webinar today. I'll also be manning the question function. Now, before I'm going to introduce our speakers, I would like to make you aware that this webinar is being recorded. That's the webinar itself, but also the question and answer session at the end. And we will be making the recording available on the CORBEL YouTube channel and on the website. So at the end, we've reserved some time for questions. And what I'd like to ask you is to add your questions to the question function. You should see that on your screen now. And then we'll go through the questions at the end. I'll briefly introduce the CORBEL project to you. So CORBEL is a Horizon 2020 funded project, and it brings together 13 research infrastructures in the biomedical sciences. CORBEL aims to transform the understanding of biological mechanisms and help translate them into medical care. Modern biological and biomedical research involves complex projects, which often combine a variety of different technologies and operate at the interface between different disciplines. Now, CORBEL aims to help these projects by harmonizing access and services for research that involves more than one RI, which could be, for instance, across biological and medical technologies, but also biological samples and data services. So today's presenters, we have with us Christian Oman. He's a mathematician by training and has over 30 years of experience in clinical trials and clinical research informatics. He was the head of the theoretical surgery unit at Heinrich Heine University of Düsseldorf, and later became the scientific head of the Coordination Center for Clinical Trials in the same university. He has since retired and now works for ECRIN as chair of the Network Committee and chair of the Independent Certification Board. He also represents ECRIN in a number of Horizon 2020 funded projects, such as CORBEL. We've got Rita Banzi. She's the coordinator of the Center for Drug Regulatory Policies at the Mario Negri Institute in Milan, and she received her BS and PhD from the University of Bologna. She's been working at Mario Negri since 2007 as staff of the Italian Cochrane Center for Development of Systematic Reviews and ECRIN European correspondent for Italy. She has an extensive experience and expertise in clinical research, systematic review methodology, and appraisal of mechanisms of marketing approvals for drugs in Europe. And then our third presenter today is Steve Canham. He's an IT consultant specializing in clinical trial data systems and data management, with 16 years of experience with clinical research systems. From 2002 to 2011, he was the head of the IT team at the Trials Unit at the Institute of Cancer Research in London, and he's currently the secretary for the ECRIN Independent Certification Board for Data Centers, the chair of ECRIN Standards Review, ECRIN Auditor, and member of the UK's International Registration Panel for Clinical Trials Units. He also represents ECRIN in several Horizon 2020 projects. Now, at this point, I'm going to hand over to our first presenter.
Okay, can you see my first slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Due to major developments and trends, data sharing and reuse of clinical trial data has become a very important topic. There are three major developments. One is a cultural change in the handling of data from research has resulted in strong promotion of a culture of openness and increased sharing of data. Open science supported by fair principles is gradually becoming a norm with relevance for clinical research. Second, it has been estimated that the overwhelming majority of research is wasted, usually because of wrong questions, badly designed, not published, or poorly reported. This diminishes the value of research and represents a significant financial loss for research in general, but specifically also for clinical trials. With more transparency, the waste of research could be reduced. And third point is that having in mind the tremendous costs of clinical trials, efficiency of knowledge generation can be increased if data from clinical trials are shared and reused for secondary analysis and meta-analysis. Consequently, many different stakeholders undertook strong efforts to bring data sharing of individual clinical participant data forward. Funders, publishers, international organizations, initiatives, research institutions, regulatory authorities, commercial companies, and others are involved. There is a tremendous and enormous potential in data sharing and reuse from clinical trials. Unnecessary duplication of studies can be avoided and the exposure of participants in future trials be reduced. Evidence on the safety and effectiveness of therapies for patients can be improved, and new hypotheses about mechanisms of disease and therapies can be derived from secondary analysis. Last but not least, for healthcare professionals and patients, better evidence is available to make more informed decisions about healthcare. Compared to other areas, sharing and reuse of clinical trial data faces some specific risks which need to be managed and mitigated adequately. Certainly, patient privacy has to be taken into consideration because of sensitive and personal data. Unfair commercial use and invalid secondary analysis may cause problems. Another concern are still missing incentives and credits for those who collected the data, the clinical trialists. But there are some more other potential risks which need to be managed and barriers to overcome. Different organizations and initiatives have in the last years developed principles, policy, guidances, and recommendations, such as the Wellcome Foundation, together with different UK institutions, the US Institute of Health, and the Nordic Trial Alliance Group. We made a review of all these kind of documents and came to the following conclusion that the available policies and recommendations are embedded in a geographical or national context, so they are dedicated to UK, US, or the Nordic countries. They are centered on a specific stakeholder group like pharmaceutical industry, or on a specific subset of clinical trial data, for example, only published data. What is still missing and needed are up-to-date, precise, broadly based, and workable recommendations supporting data sharing from clinical trials, with three focuses on non-commercial trials with a European origin and the perspective of the researcher. So within the CORBEL project, we put together a multi-stakeholder task force with around 40 experienced experts from different areas, for example, from registries, funders, publishers, regulatory bodies, from patient organizations, ethics, data protection, IT experts, and standardization bodies. In a standardized consensus process, which was performed in a sequence of 3 face-to-face meetings, we developed a consensus document on providing access to individual participant data from clinical trials. This was done with a standardized technology. This is the group nominal process. This allows getting adequate input from all the participants. And the consensus document was then put together in a publication, which recently, at the end of last year, came out in the BMG Open Journal. So now I want to hand over to Rita Banzi.
Good afternoon. I hope you can see my slides.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Christian, and thank you, Vera, and good afternoon to everybody. As mentioned by Christian, the output of this part of the CORBEL process was the development of 10 principles that emerged from the consensus process. And these principles represent what the task force saw as the fundamental requirements for any framework for the sharing and reuse of clinical trial data. The issue is obviously very complex and touches different aspects that are summarized in this figure. From the promotion of data sharing through incentives and resources, the issue of consent for data sharing, the preparation, the adequate preparation of data for being sharing, meaning the identification to reduce the risk of possible re-identification, and the structure of data to promote interoperability. All the issues related to the rights, types, and management of access, and finally the access to data and data objects and the discoverability of this data, because obviously shared data are useful only if they can be found and understood by researchers other than those who have generated them. So I will briefly introduce you principle number 1, 2, 5, 6, and 7, and then I will pass the microphone to Steve, and he will illustrate the remaining one. The first principle covered by this document is about what to do to make data sharing a reality and possibly a widespread practice planned as much as possible at the very beginning of any clinical study project. The keywords that the group highlighted in this principle are promotion, incentives, and resources. Let's see what this mean in practice. First of all, the system can work only if different actors, all the different stakeholders involved in the data in clinical research, recognize data sharing as a good practice and do something to promote it. Simple examples of this are funders or medical journals that require data sharing from the study they fund or publish, but many other examples can be done. For example, the regulatory authorities, the EMA, is currently discussing the possibility to grant access to individual patient data of the studies supporting marketing authorization in Europe. The second key aspect is that even if researchers and sponsors who generate the data may have the greatest stake in their use, they should not be perceived as a data owner, but rather data steward, meaning that they have the responsibility to ensure that data are discoverable and understood in other contexts and reused appropriately. This cultural shift, of course, cannot be done by researchers or sponsors alone. There's the need to work under an umbrella of institutional policies, meaning the policies of universities, hospitals, sponsors, and other entities that promote data sharing rather than represent a barrier to this process. Very important is that data sharing should be prospectively planned, and for future trial this will be really important. And all the different study documents from the protocol, the consent forms, the records in the trial registries, regulatory documents, and so on, should be prepared and reported on the basis of this plan for sharing data once the trial and the study is completed. For doing so, what is needed it's the availability of standards and templates and library of examples about these documents, as well as systems to monitor the compliance to these plans. A key driver of this cultural change is surely the development of an adequate set of incentives for data sharing, and to make data sharing become really a good habit of researchers. In the academic world, of course, citations are one of the most potent leverage and incentives. So shared data sets should be considered legitimate, citable products of research and adequately considered in the researcher's career evaluation, or for instance when trying to access to funding for research. The last but of course not the least aspect covered by this principle is the issue of financial models to support data sharing, because these are very important, especially to ensure a long-term sustainability of data and data curation, data storage and access. Let's quickly go to principle number 2, that is about the need for an explicit, broad consent from trial participants for their data to be shared. This was a quite debated issue among the group, but finally the consensus was achieved on the fact that there is the simplest way to avoid any legal and ethical issue after the trial completion is to collect an explicit consent for data sharing, that it's considered different from the consent to trial participation. And let's go into the details of this principle. As already mentioned, the consent to share data for use should be explicit, and in a way should be separate from the consent to participate to the trial. But of course, the two consents should be, as much as possible and as it's feasible, collected at the same time. And then the second issue, very important issue, is the fact that the consent for sharing data and reuse data cannot be fully informed at the time when the consent is collected, because we know that the nature, purposes, and final use of the data that might occur after the trial completes are almost impossible to predict. So the concept here is that the consent should be a broad consent. Of course, this does not mean that we don't know anything about the destination of the data, and we should provide to the trial participant the information about the reason why sharing data could benefit the knowledge and the science and the society as a whole, and also provide all the available information about how data will be prepared, stored, and which will be the mechanism of access of this data. Of course, all this communication should be done as soon as possible with a clear and concise language to be understood by the trial participants. The last point under this principle that was highly debated among the group is the right to withdraw a consent after the trial completion or during the trial execution. Of course, the right to withdraw is something well established, and it's also covered by the new regulation for data protection in Europe. But there are a lot of practical difficulties, especially when data sets are anonymized, and we will talk about this later, or when data sets are transferred to other user or other repositories. So the right to withdraw, of course, is there, but we should also try to explain how practical this will be and to implement system to make this possible. Okay, let's go quickly to a group of principles that deals with the rights, types, and management of access of data after that after the data are shared. Here, the group was of the opinion that access to individual participant data and trial documents should be as open as possible and as close as necessary, and that any citizen, regardless of his or her professional role, can have the right to request access to data in the framework of a more controlled or managed access. And we will see what we mean with that. And the third principle in this regards regards the characteristics of any model for data access request that should be explicit, reproducible, and transparent. Very quickly, I will. Clinical trial data sharing, clinical study data sharing is a complex issue, so it's not realistic that one single model can fit to all the different situations. While trial documents, such as protocols, informed consent, and other documents are expected to be openly accessible without restrictions, some forms of managed access to individual patients' data may be needed, depending, for example, on the nature of the consent, the risk of a re-identification, concerns about misuse of data, or concerns about disease that can pose stigma on trial participants. Irrespective of the data access model, some basic rules that are needed to ensure a fair process are mandatory, at least in the opinion of the group. And for example, the identification of who is requiring data, the statement to not attempt to re-identify a subject in a data set or across different data sets, or the acknowledgement of the data generator or the publication of secondary analysis. In some cases, the establishment of boards overseeing data sharing process may be necessary, and the roles and responsibility of these boards may vary depending on the type of access model, from being an advisory of the process to more sophisticated boards that can decide if a given request for data access is valid or not. As I mentioned before, the rights to request data should not be limited on the basis of the professional role, so meaning that not only researchers, but may, for example, citizen representatives or journalists, scientific journalists, can have the right to access data if they have a reasonable request, scientific hypothesis to pursue. And We also explore the issue of a collaboration between data generator and data users that may, of course, be an added value of data access and reuse, but cannot be considered a prerequisite for data sharing. Also, we explore the issue of data user agreement. This is something that appeared to be useful to clarify roles and responsibilities of data generator, data reuser, repositories, and so on. Surely it's unavoidable from a legal perspective. Anyhow, they should be kept as simple as possible. And again, if standards are available or guidelines on how to prepare this data use agreement, it will be very useful for the researchers. And again, they should not represent a barrier to data sharing. Finally, friendly interfaces to request and access the data and metrics to monitor the access and reuse of this data can be very useful and provide many information about the process itself and possible gaps and barriers in the different models. The last part is about transparency of secondary analysis. Of course, we should ask to people asking and reusing data to comply with the same standard of transparency as the primary data generator applied. So all the methods and results of secondary analysis should be made publicly available, irrespective of the fact that they will come out in a scientific publication or not. Okay, this is the first set of principles. I thank you, and I now going to hand over to Steve.
Okay, so I've got 5 principles to run through. They're all essentially about different aspects of data management. So the first one basically says that to protect the privacy of trial participants, it is necessary to de-identify the data before it's shared. And that de-identification requirement is the first specific recommendation in this section. Now, the de-identification is independent of whether the data is anonymous or pseudonymous. Obviously, clinical trial data tends to start off as pseudonymous. Oops. And we would recommend that shared data should also be pseudonymous, in the sense that the original researchers still have the pseudonymizing links, the identifying links, even though to the recipients of the shared data it will be anonymized. The reason for that is if the data is still pseudonymous, then if an issue arises that suggests that further research should be done on some or all of the trial participants, then that is possible. It would almost certainly require additional consent. It would be a separate research project, but at least it is possible. If the data was completely anonymized, then it would be impossible to return to the original participants and do any further work. So de-identification techniques exist. They're in the literature. They can be applied. I'm not going to go into the details here, but at the end of that process, it is necessary to look at the residual risks. And in fact, in Europe, under the GDPR, the new regulations, there is an explicit requirement for a data protection impact assessment, which would probably be required at this point. And the whole process, of course, needs to be documented. So we believe that any attempted re-identification should be explicitly forbidden, not just legally, but perhaps with social, financial, scientific sanctions as well. And as Rita was saying, we strongly recommend that explicit consent for sharing is sought, certainly in the future. We appreciate that most existing data does not have that consent. It is possible, under some circumstances, for data still to be shared without explicit consent. It depends very much on the legal framework. I think in the US, this is probably possible now. In Europe, it will depend really on how the GDPR is interpreted by different organizations. The problem is that the GDPR does not give a completely uniform picture across Europe with research data. So we will have to see how it will be interpreted and how those interpretations evolve. In terms of services, we are aware that in order to de-identify data properly, many people will need support, both for de-identification and for the risk assessment process. And organizations like ECRIN, if the demand is there, may usefully develop those services. So moving on to the next principle, this is simply asking for a much greater use of data standards in order that data remains interoperable, particularly when trying to aggregate data from different sources. So yeah, the key thing here is that the use of data standards, coding standards, category standards, etc., has to be built in from the studies from the outset. To try and retrofit data standards onto existing databases is very expensive, very error-prone, and time-consuming. So the standards should be built in as part of the design requirement, at least in the future. We recommend that people look at the CDISC standards in particular. CDISC has created a whole suite of standards and are widely used within the commercial sector. And we feel that things like CDASH and the therapeutic area standards are useful starting points for introducing data standards. Of course, there are other standards that can be used, METADATA for adverse event reporting, for instance. So there is a need, particularly within non-commercial units, to become much more familiar with data standards and indeed to help develop them, because standards have often been developed in the past by the commercial sector with the emphasis on submission documents. And they've not always met the particular requirements of academic units. So people from the non-commercial sector need to get more involved in the various standards development processes. There also needs to be not just data standards, but also metadata standards. At the moment, people use a wide variety of metadata methods, ranging from spreadsheets to ODM, XML, define XML, types of metadata description. So we need to move to more consistency so that it's easier for people to understand what data is available. And finally, we need to make sure that the data itself is in a file format that can be easily read, not some proprietary format from some version of a particular software package, but something like CSV or XML, essentially text that can be read by a wide variety of systems and which is likely to remain readable for some time. So that's principle 4. 2 further principles. So the first is relatively uncontentious. We are saying essentially that if you're going to share data, that's fine, that's one thing, but you also need to share the documents associated with the study for people to make sense of that data. In particular, protocols, but also things like statistical analysis plans, CSRs if they exist, patient information sheets, etc. The whole gamut of documents that a trial produces needs to be shared as well. And in general, we would say that they can be shared much more easily than the data itself. Generally, they can be shared publicly and shared more easily. So the second principle here is the need to put data into a suitable dedicated repository, rather than simply keeping it on the departmental file share and saying that if someone ever asks for it, it's available. We feel that it is necessary to actually manage this and use a suitable repository. That could be at an institutional level. Many institutions are developing their own data repositories now. It could be a disease-specific repository or a more general one that stores a whole range of data types. The point is that the data is moved and explicitly managed for long-term storage. So, yeah, the repositories used need to have certain features and processes in place, particularly when talking about sensitive data that's not simply publicly available. And that means defining what those features are and then checking that the repositories meet them. And then making that information available to researchers and sponsors so that they can distinguish between the repositories and make the most appropriate choice for long-term data management. The key here really is long-term, because trial teams, individuals, even whole departments can change or evolve or disappear. So that putting the data and related documents into a repository gives that long-term storage capability. Again, for sensitive data in particular, when controlled access is required, the transfer to a repository is not a simple upload. There needs to be a formal data transfer agreement, in particular about who controls in the future the process of managing access requests, who makes the decisions, and how the whole process is followed through. Another system that has sometimes been put forward as useful in this context is what is often known as an analysis environment. That is an infrastructure where data sets and other documents can be put together, assembled perhaps from different sources, analyzed together, not downloaded usually, but viewed and analyzed in situ, and then the results documented, after which the aggregation of data is destroyed. Now, this is something that has been usefully developed in other scientific domains, but it isn't clear if we need similar facilities with clinical trial data, because at the moment it is very difficult to merge it, to aggregate that data, though it may be something that develops in the future. If it does, then clearly we need mechanisms to import data from different sources, and then facilities to analyze it and document that analysis. So on to the final principle, which is about discoverability. And this is simply saying, particularly given what is likely to be a steadily growing number of repositories, indeed almost a mosaic of different types and numbers of repositories with different data sets and documents within them, how can anyone actually easily find all the material? So we were recommending that there is a metadata schema that can be applied to the various data objects, and then that metadata should be aggregated together and made searchable by both humans and machines. So first of all, you need the metadata schema, and we have been working on one for clinical research data objects in ECRIN, but we now need to complete that work. We need to persuade repositories and others to use that metadata schema, or at least a version that could be a version of a schema that can be mapped onto it, so that the metadata becomes widely available from different repositories. We need to make sure that the different data objects, data sets, documents, etc., are citable and identifiable, so they need identifiers. DOIs are the obvious type of identifier to use, so these are traditionally used for public objects. And here we're talking about data objects that might not yet be public, so we need to make sure that the DOI minting process can be extended in that way. We need tools, perhaps fairly simple web-based forms, to help users, to help the data generators apply the metadata, the discovery metadata that we're talking about. And we need some tools in addition to harvest that metadata from APIs, for example, set up on the repositories to bring the metadata together. We need clearly a metadata repository to allow people to search the aggregated metadata. And the key thing here is to have a single portal that people can access. Whether or not there is a single or multiple metadata repositories underneath that is less important. And finally, a key requirement is for a mechanism to pay for all of this in the long term. There's no point in having a project-based system. This proposal, if it's going to be useful at all, needs to be permanent. So that was the final principle. That was a very, very quick gallop through the principles and main recommendations. We would recommend, if you haven't already, getting hold of the BMJ Open paper, which obviously gives a much more measured discussion of these issues and provides a much fuller treatment of the various things that we have talked about. And now for the final slide here, and this is simply to give you an indication of what we're discussing now as possible next steps. And these range from developing general material, for example, examples of SOPs on data sharing that people could make use of, general background training material about data sharing. plus some material that could be used in the context of specific studies, such as data use agreements, templates for data transfer, various checklists that people could use. And we're also discussing various IT tools and the development of a metadata repository itself. In fact, within another H2020 project, we are trying to develop just such a metadata repository. And that's the final slide from the presentation. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
So what we'll do is we'll go towards questions. One question was whether the slides and the recording will be made available afterwards, and the answer is yes. It will probably take up to a week for the recording to become available, and it will be accessible through the CORBEL website and the CORBEL YouTube channel. Now, we've had a couple of questions submitted both in advance and during the webinar itself. If you'd like to add a question, and please type it into the interface. I'll start with a few of the questions that have been submitted in advance. So one of the questions we had is, are researchers obliged to share their clinical data? Which one of the speakers would like to start with that one?
Well, I can start, Christian Oman. Yes, there are measures that researchers are obliged to share their clinical data. For example, several funders require data sharing as a condition of grants, such as the MRC or the NIH in the US. And the same is true for many journals like BMJ or PLOS Medicine and others, which demand to make all relevant data available upon reasonable request. Then there are specific institutional policies at universities who also foresee data sharing. So this is something which is more and more increasing. Maybe Rita or Steve can add.
Well, I think the examples provided by Christian represent the current status of the request for IPD sharing, but many other stakeholders are discussing about this issue. So we could expect that in the next years this practice will become more widespread and standard.
Okay, thank you. Then an additional question we've got is, in daily practice, when needing to enroll participants and get them consented, isn't there the risk that consent is not given if it requests also consent to data sharing and reuse?
Rita's here. Yes, the simple answer to the question is yes, there is the risk, especially because there's always a big concern when health data in general are to be shared, while we have probably less reluctances in share other type of data, of personal data that are as sensible as health data. But anyway, I think having the development of standard practice and guidelines and systems that will implement a fair data sharing will also have an impact on the reluctances of trial participants in sharing their own data. So this is not a fixed barrier, and of course there is the need to understand if this is a real barrier or a perceived barrier, and to understand better what trial participants or citizen or the public in general is thinking about this issue, because on the other hand, there are groups of patients and group of citizens that already share their own health data without anyone that is asking for that. So I think the attitude here is really specific of different groups or different countries. So we really need to get evidence on this and to see if having a standardized procedure and more guidelines on how to do it will improve the system.
Maybe if I can add, we also had a very tough discussion on this point during our consensus conferences. And it was discussed whether the consent to data sharing should be automatically included in the informed consent to the clinical trial. And after long discussion and also looking at the rules and regulations, we finally decided that these two processes can be done at the same occasion, but they are different processes. The informed consent is different from the consent to data sharing. But I must admit, this is discussed.
Okay, thank you. Then we've got a few questions around data standards. So one of the questions we've got is regarding data standards. The existing CDISC standard is certainly a good opportunity to adopt to start with. However, many academic trials still do not have the needed resources to be CDISC compliant. Adding to these, that becoming familiar with the CDISC standard is costly. Should we not also emphasize more accessibility of CDISC standard within academic institutions, and how?
Yes, is the short answer to that. There is a problem. We need a CDISC standards. It will take time and resources to make sure people are familiar with them and can use them. I think the approach needs to be to start off with something fairly straightforward like C-, which looks at commonly used data items and definitions for those, and then gradually move into, if you like, more sophisticated CDISC standards, the therapeutic area standards, ultimately possibly STTM. But I think that is a huge resource ask for non-commercial trials, unless they are involved in some way supporting submission documents. But I think it's possible. I think it will take time. Certainly. Okay,
we've got another question around standards, which is when there is no definite data standards, such as for epidemiological information, what kind of point should we start collecting data? So I'm not entirely sure if I understand the question. Is one of the speakers able to comment, or should we get some clarification?
I think we need some clarification, but in general, it re-emphasizes the point that academic units or non-commercial units need to become more involved and with standard generation, standard creation, because if you like, the areas which the drug companies are not interested in are the areas where the standards don't exist.
Okay, what I suggest is, if that didn't clarify the question, please rephrase it and just submit it again. Okay, we've got also a question around GDPR. So how will the implementation of the data protection legislation affect sharing clinical trials data?
I think the problem is that we're not entirely sure. You would think that with a general data protection regulation, everything would be simplified and crystal clear. In fact, as we understand it, and we had several lawyers basically asked this question, who were part of the group who put the recommendations together. As we understand it, the GDPR allows quite a lot of freedom for national legislations, national regulators to make their own interpretation when it comes to research data in particular, and sensitive research data. So it still is a question really of waiting to see how the GDPR will be interpreted in different countries. For example, apparently I'm told that in Denmark, they've decided that the GDPR will also apply to the data from deceased people for 10 years, which I don't think is the case elsewhere in Europe. So there are these differences emerging. But I think there are some, one of the consequences of the GDPR is the need for explicit consent wherever possible. And another one is the need for a data protection impact assessment when data is made shareable.
Yeah, maybe I can add, Steve, there are some potentials within the GDPR. For example, data objects and data subjects should be allowed to give their consent to certain areas of scientific research. So in principle, according to law, but this is also has to be interpreted carefully by the bodies. It may be possible to perform a kind of broad consent. And if this is possible, this would really help data sharing in the future. So there are some elements in the law, for example, also pseudonymous is defined in the law. So it's not all negative. There's some potential.
Okay, thank you. So one of the other questions is, can you describe the difference between de-identification, pseudo-anonymization, and anonymization?
Oh yeah, I can try. I'm sure the others will come in as well. De-identification is simply the removal of identifying data from the data set, and is independent of whether it's pseudonymized or anonymized. So it's a different process, if you like. And as I understand it, it doesn't have a legal status within Europe. It is a term used within the US HIPAA regulations, but not within the GDPR. Anonymization and pseudonymization, well, as anonymization means you cannot reasonably refix the data onto a named individual. Pseudonymization means that there exists additional data that allows that fixing onto an individual to take place. But the difficulty then is when does pseudonymization, when does that data is so unavailable, if you like, that the data becomes effectively anonymized, and that's when the legal fog starts to descend.
Okay, thank you. Does one of the other speakers want to add anything to that?
Well, Rita's here. Just from a non-technical point of view, as the one I'm representing in the group, the important thing is not to consider anonymization or pseudonymization a black or white process. There's always a degree of possibilities to remove identifiers and to play with data. There are anonymous or pseudonymous, but we should always consider the fact that, especially with the clinical trial data and health data, there will be one possibility to refix the person with the data. So it's quite different to obtain a fully anonymized data set.
Maybe one short comment. In the publication mentioned by Steve, we have identified these three terms, and we have also compared the different characteristics. So there is more detailed information explicitly on this issue.
Okay, thank you. In that case, we'll move on to the next question. So you already referred to FAIR related aspects like access and interoperability. In the light of the EU EOSC initiative, do you also see a role for cloud deployment of data?
Yes, absolutely. We see a role for a health research cloud or for a cloud for clinical research. And for any kind of clinical research, whether it's clinical trials or observational studies or epidemiological studies. Currently, in different EU projects, we are discussing how how could be the architecture of such a cloud, and what should be the governance, what are the legal and ethical issues, and this is quite complicated, because on one hand we have sensitive health data, on the other hand we have a very complicated infrastructure with a chain of providers, with contracts and service level agreements and so on. And it is very important that the cloud for clinical research is really secure and transparent. Only if this is the case, then there will be trust in this new technology. So I'm quite optimistic, but it is not an easy task, and a lot of work has to be done to make it happen, and to make it happen really securely.
Yeah, I mean, just to reinforce what Christian is saying, I'm sure many of the infrastructures that will be used for data storage and metadata storage will be cloud-based, depending how you define cloud. But to be honest, exactly where it is, the infrastructure shouldn't actually matter to the users. What's much more important is the access mechanisms and the control over access. And the problem with a lot of current scientific clouds is that they're based on a very open public access model. And so control of sensitive data hasn't really been developed yet in many cases.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the next question. This was one submitted in advance. Does MRI data sharing pose different and more serious ethical issues than biological sample sharing?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. Yes, it's some issues related to images. The prior to distribution, the data must be de-identified, which means that the links between identity of the subject and their data must be destroyed. And with imaging data, this is not so easy. This includes, for example, the removal of facial structures of high-resolution MRI data. So there are some specifics with images, and especially with MRIs.
Another question is, are you going to organize initiatives to involve patient groups, citizens, and ethic committees in the debate?
Yes, I mean, in the CORBEL project, in the CORBEL multi-stakeholder task force, we had a couple of patients representatives from important European organization of patients representative, and the idea is to try to collaborate with a patients group also in different countries to understand their attitude, and possibly to engage them in the development of standards and procedures. I can just mention one initiative from Italy, from our institution, the Mario Negri Institute. We run a survey of patients group about this issue, and we are collaborating with other groups linked to the Cochrane collaborations to go into the details of the different aspects engaging citizen and the patients group. So we are at the very beginning, and any suggestion for collaboration and share of ideas will be very welcomed. We are not currently working with ethical committee, but this is also another very important step to be done.
Okay, thank you. We are coming up on the hour. I've got one last question to finish with, which is, how can individuals help to promote a culture shift towards data sharing and reuse of data? Would any of the speakers like to take that one?
Yeah, we seem a bit reluctant. It's a very good question. I think it depends on where and how the individual is working and what their function is, to be honest. So, for example, people involved in data management, it would be a case of promoting the use of standards and you know, and making sure these things were introduced into study design from an early stage. I think from the sponsor's TRIDIS point of view, it's about well, I think we need to develop the services where people have a better idea of the repositories available and how they can plan their data sharing in the long term, or if not their data sharing, the planning of making data available for sharing, making it, preparing it for sharing. So I think it depends on the individuals concerned.
Yeah, I see. Rita, go on.
Sorry, now we all have to say something. No, well, from a more general point of view, the cultural shift that's any one of us as citizen or person can do is linked to the perception of ownership of data. I think we can't forget about the fact that any data generated in a context of a clinical research process is to be considered as a public good rather than a private property of sponsor hospitals or whatever you want. So I think if this idea is more commonly understood by people and not, of course, overcome by bad behaviors and misuse of data, this can promote a cultural shift toward a more opening of data.
Maybe very shortly, if you look at, for example, citizens or politicians or policy makers, to convince them is really to demonstrate benefits of data sharing. And here we are at the beginning. We're just talking about how we can do it, how we can introduce data sharing and bring it into praxis. But the important point is later on that it really improves health by getting new knowledge, by being more efficient, and this is very important, and I think this is one of the major tasks for the next years.
Okay, thank you. There are more questions streaming in, but I'm aware that we are already running over time. So what I suggest is what we will do is ask the speakers to answer the additional questions in writing, and we can then add that to the website. Now, what I would like to do to finish is to just announce our next webinar, which is Single Sign-On for Life Science Services. And this webinar will run on the 17th of April. It will start a little bit earlier than this webinar. Now, for today, I'd like to very much thank our speakers. It's been really great to have you. And thank you as well to all the attendees, also for having a lot of questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to answer all of them, and we will try and make sure that we provide some guidance in writing for the other questions. So thank you very much.